Welcome to Inside Pride, where we take a peek into the San Francisco LGBT Pride Celebration Committee's mission to educate the world, commemorate our heritage, celebrate our culture, and liberate our people. Today, we're chatting with Amy Sueyoshi. Amy is the Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. They are the first female-bodied dean of the first College of Ethnic Studies in the nation, which offers over 8,000 seats across 170 ethnic studies courses each semester. Amy has authored 2 books, Queer Compulsions, Race, Nation, and Sexuality in the Affairs of Yoni Noguchi, and A Discriminating Sex, White Leisure, and the Making of the American Oriental. Amy is also a founding co-curator of the GLBT Museum, the first queer history museum in the United States, and co-chair of the inaugural Queer History Conference hosted by the Committee on LGBT History. Amy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Can you share a little bit about yourself, the work you do, and what SF Pride means to you?
Sure. So I'm a trained historian, which means I have a PhD in history. My first job was at San Francisco State University. My research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of Asian American history and history of sexuality. And so I used to teach courses on race and sex, and now I'm largely an administrator. I also very firmly believe to think of history as a site of activism, a tool of activism. And so I try to make history as accessible and inspiring as possible.
Amazing. I feel like most deans kind of yearn to be primarily educators from time to time. Are you planning to teach any courses again in the near future?
So most deans probably yearn to teach, but they don't teach depending on the size of their college and the kinds of obligations they have. I do continue to volunteer teach one course a semester. So right now I'm teaching the history of sexuality for the MA graduate students in the Sexuality Studies program at San Francisco State. And I continue to teach because I find teaching to be inspiring and uplifting, and it often takes me away from the painful ways in which administration can be soul-sucking, just to be very frank. There's a lot of personnel management, and so in some ways you see the worst of people when you're in management. However, when you're teaching, you see the best in people, or you try to see the best in people, like you see people improve, right? So in some ways, I feel like I can continue to be a teacher and be inspired by education, while at the same time also having this job in management, which is not always pleasant, but much needed nonetheless.
I only took one queer theory class in grad school, and it was really difficult and really Eurocentric, but it was amazing. And I would love to audit something that you were teaching sometime.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. You're welcome to sit in. I think queer theory in particular can be very difficult. Theorists tend to write in a language that is not mainstream, right? They use their own language that's very specific to their discipline. If you took a history class, queer history class, it would probably have been much more accessible. Historians pride themselves on writing in a storytelling sort of way. But queer theory can radically change the way you see the world. And in that way, even if it's Eurocentric, it can be life-changing.
It really was. Listen, tell us a little bit about your curation work with the GLBT Historical Society. You co-created Labor of Love, which is a show about the first 10 years of San Francisco Pride. For that, what were some of the most fascinating things that your research turned up?
So I was working on Labor of Love while I was still a board member. And as a board member, we faced the usual struggles that a board faces, both managing our responsibility to the public and our membership, as well as managing the organization or overseeing the management of an agency. And so those kinds of difficulties and conflicts, I think I didn't expect to see in the early days of Pride, but I saw them very much in the source material. I'm also involved in API Kitsy, which is a grassroots organization. No one is paid. It's an all volunteer staff and largely listserv currently. And we host a number of events. And we, whatever, there's drama, but not the same kind of drama. I think because no one is paid, there's not a paid membership, it's not a formalized organization. So I imagined Pride in its first 10 years to be similarly grassroots, perhaps more, congenial, right? And more less political stuff than a formal organization might have. But it was deeply political with some very serious conflicts, even in its first 10 years. One of the most notable things that I realized was that there were actually competing prides, competing gay freedom days, and that one was jockeying to be the pride event versus the other. That's interesting to me because today we think of there being only sort of one big pride, right? We can't imagine sort of competing prides. And granted, all the different queer communities have their own pride events during Pride weekend, but there still remains only one big San Francisco Pride that draws, tourists from all over the world.
Yeah. As you're putting the show together, the Historical Society is a fairly small space, and the show was primarily virtual through its run. But did anything get left on the proverbial cutting room floor that you wish you had been able to have room for?
Yeah, so what I really enjoyed looking at was all the different the covers of all the different Pride programs that were done each year. This is one I'm using the background one from 1978 here. What was really interesting was that many of the program covers had like the US flag, themes from the American Revolution, right? It's very much about citizenship and seeing all the evolution of like a fairly radical gay freedom day politic on the cover um, through this American nationalism, but it's actually kind of like trying to queer American citizenship. So I'm sure they thought of it as radical at the time, whereas today we just want to throw the US into the garbage as a nation state, right? And then, to imagine sort of how the program covers have changed across time, I think would have been nice, which we wanted to do the visual representation in the brick and mortar museum, to have like all the different program covers, but we were not able to do that, obviously, because we didn't have the brick and mortar museum exhibit, and then we decided not to do it for the online exhibit.
Amazing. First of all, the typeface on the thing behind you is
Yeah.
it's like Star Trek, but a little bit, I don't know, it looks very commercially done, but it's really great. The F and the R together are just a dream. But let me ask you a little bit about queering American citizenship in the context of the 1970s, right? Because that was the Carter years. It was sort of this kind of last gasp of pre-Reaganite liberalism, right? People thought that the Equal Rights Amendment would pass, and clearly LGBT people were making pretty good strides before, the inevitable pushback. But there was kind of a tension, maybe, or was there a tension between sort of separatism and establishing like a fully functioning queer community versus integrating into the larger society to maybe make it less homophobic? Is that what you mean by queering American citizenship?
Yeah, when I say queering American citizenship, I think it's definitely not about separatism. It's about a radical change of American citizenship that is in fact queer, right? So it would have been, I mean, the gay liberationists back in the day were all about sort of tearing down the system, but also in a way that in which they belong to it, right? So I think that there's a way in which there was so little access to mainstream acceptance, in terms of employment, healthcare, right? That all these things like asking for that was seen as a voice of radicalism. I wouldn't say that. I mean, obviously there's different groups, right? Like there's like the lesbian separatists, right? Who wanted to create their own woman's land, right? And then there's obviously folks who are involved in mainstream gay politics that want to bring gays and lesbians, right? That's the language that they used at the time, into the fabric of mainstream politics. And I'm sure that there were some conflicts between those two groups. They probably wouldn't sit at the bar and have a drink together. But I do think that there's a myth around separatists that they wanted to totally be not involved in part of sort of the mainstream community, which is not necessarily the case. They wanted a separate community where they could sustain themselves, right? But they weren't necessarily kind of like the lesbian separatists, for example. They weren't necessarily anti-men in the ways that lesbophobes like to portray them, right? Separatism very much meant, and this is also in the cultural nationalist movements, but separatism very much meant sort of sustaining one's community with one's resources, right? But also welcoming, being a part of a larger society and welcoming support and resources from that larger society if it still meant having sovereignty and self-determination in the way you lived your life.
That is a great point. Thank you. In light of the events of the past year, we're 51 weeks into this pandemic, the effects on the queer community's sort of inability to gather publicly and visibly. Is there anything about the exhibit, about Pride's first 10 years, that you now see in a different light?
I mean, I think that gathering is absolutely important. And I'm a little bit more on the introvert scale. And so sometimes I don't really want to go out and socialize, but, I've, even before COVID, I've always thought about sort of, if, when I hit 80, when I hit 70, I'll probably feel more isolated, right? I won't have as great of a social network as I do now. And so I try to embrace the social network that I have now and go out to events and be social, even if I don't want to be social. Um, I do think that not having a physical pride this past year, a face-to-face pride, I should say, um, really drove home the importance of having a physical queer community. I've always known that it's important to have a physical queer community. I would say that, when I go to bars in the Castro, I don't want to go to a bar that's overrun with straight people. So as queers become more popular, gay men become part, like almost like a cultural commodity, right? Especially for straight women to have. Um, I just feel like the gay bars have become less gay, and it makes me sad, right? I mean, not only do we have very few, if not any, lesbian bars, the gay bars are becoming also less gay, right? And I think on one hand, it's great to have this mainstream acceptance, but it's also, I feel, to me, very important to have a space that's all queer, to be able to mingle and interact with only queers, to be able to tell gay jokes and be inappropriate and have it still be appropriate, right? I feel like all this, that our secret code, so to speak, which may not be so secret anymore, but the ways in which we joke with each other, speak with one another, assume things about each other, is part of a queer community that is very difficult to forge when it's not face to face. With that said, too, I just want to also add that, like, I get it that, the Castro may not be a space so welcoming for me, being Asian and female bodied and also, on the shorter side. Often when I go to gay bars that are almost all men, I feel like I'm in the midst of all these tall trees and I'm like a little ant, and people usually, literally just trample over me. Or if I'm standing in line to get a drink at the bar, it's like all of a sudden I can't even get to the bar, right? But at the same time, there's usually like one or two gay guys there that are like, hey, get this dyke a drink, or like the bartender is like, I got you, I'm going to get you a drink, right? And even that queer community, like even in a space where I might feel a little bit invisible, right? I still feel seen. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's this feeling of still being recognized as a queer in a queer space that may not be totally accepting of who I am.
I think that makes total sense. And when this is all over, if you'll permit me, I would love to invite you out. We can go to a gay bar and we can gay it the hell out. We can be so inappropriately appropriate or appropriately inappropriate, whichever one you prefer. We're gonna do it. One last question for you. So, racist attacks against Asian American communities are regrettably on the rise. From your perspective as a historian studying marginalized groups, how do you view these appalling actions and the way they might be galvanizing Asian Americans' responses?
So I just read a op-ed piece in the New York Times by J. Caspian Kang. Um, and in it, the op-ed piece made it seem like there was no violence against Asian Americans previously, and that there was no Asian American community previously. And both of those assumptions are actually incorrect. So in California in particular, we've seen Chinatowns being burned to the ground, Chinese residents being forced to move out of the city and live on beaches, right? Because there's no room for them in these spaces. We've also seen both Chinese and Japanese immigrants being lynched, hanging from trees. This is a part of California history. Um, as an individual, I've faced racist attacks my entire life. I've actually I was born in San Francisco. And even up until just, 7 years ago, when I was, living in the Sunset District of San Francisco, a white guy called me a chink on the bus. And this is like in a neighborhood that's like 70% Asian, right? And I do think that, part of the reason why I get harassed, obviously, is because I am small. I'm clearly queer. If people look at me long enough, they realize that I'm female bodied. So maybe I won't kick their ass when they call me a chink or a bitch, right? And so, ironically, there's a way in which during COVID, now that I've been at home, I've actually been harassed less and faced less racist attacks because I'm at home, and usually my cat nor my partner throws racial epithets at me or tries to punch me in the face as I'm walking down the street. So what I'm trying to say is that these kinds of harassment and racism has existed throughout Asian American history. I think the way that our society is built, because it's patriarchal, many Asian American men have not faced as much harassment and racist aggression on the street, especially if you live in a town that is largely Asian American, like San Francisco. So I know lots of Asian American men who are appalled at the visibility of violence against Asian Americans, and appalled sometimes when their wives come home and these are straight guys, when their wives come home and say that they were hiking and someone spat on them. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that violence and hatred against Asian Americans has existed since their very arrival on American soil. There's a lot of visibility around it now, which I think is great. I think that there's a way in which people think that Asian Americans don't face discrimination in America, which is, again, a total myth. It's completely incorrect. There's also a way in which people think Asian Americans are not organizing, which is, again, very much incorrect. And so what we see in the late 60s is an Asian American movement that rises. It's the first time when Chinese, Filipinos, and Japanese see themselves as a larger Asian American community. Yuji Ichioka was someone who coined the term Asian American. So it is a recent concept to feel Asian American or to have an identity that's Asian American, but it is not a solidarity movement that arose in the midst of COVID. It's something that's been around at least since the late 1960s, just to be clear. And this is not directed at you, Peter, but to a larger public that may not be aware of the kinds of organizing that has gone around. In terms of the visibility, I just want to be very clear that there's a number of viral videos that have gone viral, and they've been specifically about Black youth attacking who we presume is Asian American. That one guy who was 95 in Chinatown in Oakland, turns out that he was actually Latino, right? Um, but what I want to kind of point out is that I would like the public to think about what videos go viral, right? Like, why isn't it that the videos of white people spitting on us and calling us chink don't go viral, right? Why isn't it that the videos of the white people punching us don't go viral, right? Why is it that, we're so fascinated with Black youth beating up on Asians? And so it's just important for us to remember that the media really likes to portray uh, interracial conflict, right? Especially when it's between communities of color. They just love displaying that on the newspaper, right? They never talk about all the incredible organizing efforts that are going on between Black and Asian communities, not just now, but also, immediately after the Rodney King verdict and the Watts uprising. There was a lot of organizing that went on between Black and Korean immigrant communities. There's also organizing that went on in San Francisco immediately after World War II, with in the Western Addition neighborhood, in between Fillmore and Japantown. As the Japanese were incarcerated during World War II, many African Americans moved into those neighborhoods. And when Japanese Americans came back, there was it was a political necessity to build solidarity, right? But again, I think that there's ways in which the media will like to highlight specific kinds of conflict. And then we as a public that may not be educated around media images, then kind of gobble that up. We get sucked into this thing that really seems compelling, right? And so I think on one hand, I'm glad that, Stop AAPI Hate, which one of our faculty members at San Francisco State started, Russell Jung. I'm glad that these things are happening and we're counting hate crimes, but we were not even counting hate crimes before COVID. Like, how messed up is that? Like, people didn't think that hate crimes against Asian Americans, A, were worth counting, and B, Asian Americans didn't even have the sensibility that we should be recording hate crimes. Because I think, like most folks of color, when things happen to us, for queers as well, like for many queers, when things happen to us, we think it's our fault, right? So we kind of like swallow it and keep moving. Sometimes we try to forget it, right? But I just want to be very clear to the larger viewer that hate crimes, discrimination, harassment against Asian Americans has always been here. I do think that there's probably more incidents due to COVID because there's more COVID specific incidences that are going on. And I also realize that because of Stop AAPI Hate, that there's more record of it, that you can actually count the number. And then obviously these high profile videos that become viral has drawn national attention. I would just like folks to continue to think about why these specific videos have attracted national attention. I also want to underscore that the vast majority of violence against the Asian American community has been by white folks, right? Both state, structural, and personal violence. And also, I hate to call out my own peeps, but Asian American men have also been involved, implicated in sex trafficking, domestic abuse, partner abuse, right? And so if we want to eradicate violence in our communities, obviously it's important to look at the national climate, but also important to look at ourselves internally, to think about the ways in which we continue to also, allow violence to exist within our own communities.
Thank you for that really thoughtful answer to that question. I had the privilege of speaking with you once before, and you were just as articulate and measured in your responses then. So I really appreciate you again today. This has been Inside Pride. Our guest today was Amy Sueyoshi, former Pride board member and dean at San Francisco State University. I'm your sickening host, Peter-Astrid Kane. Look for another episode of Inside Pride next month. Thanks.